He wasn't supposed to notice her. In a place where laughter clinked against glass and silverware sang softly under warm yellow lights, she had mastered the quiet art of disappearing. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And if you believe no soul should feel invisible in a crowded room, stay with me. Because this story begins with a girl no one chose to see. The diner sat just off Route 9, somewhere between a gas station that smelled like burnt coffee and a stretch of highway that never seemed to end. The kind of place where people came and went without remembering each other's faces, where conversations blurred into background noise and the hum of an old refrigerator filled the spaces in between. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when the sunlight slants low through the windows and turns dust into gold, when the booths are half full and the world feels suspended between rush and rest. And in the far corner, near a window smudged with fingerprints and time, sat Lily Harper, 10 years old. Small for her age. Her wheelchair was tucked carefully against the edge of the table, as if even it was trying not to take up too much space. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, fingers folded together, still, patient, practiced. She wore a pale blue sweater, sleeves slightly too long, the fabric worn soft at the cuffs from nervous pulling. Her hair, light brown and tied loosely at the back, slipped forward every time she tilted her head down, which was often. Because looking down meant not seeing the way people looked at her. Or worse, the way they didn't. A family had passed her table 10 minutes ago. The mother had smiled politely, then gently guided her son to another booth, her hand resting just a little too firmly on his shoulder. Not unkind, just distant, like Lily existed behind glass. Another couple had walked in, glanced once, then chosen seats near the counter instead, closer to noise, further from discomfort. Lily had noticed. She always noticed. But she never reacted. That was the rule she had learned without being taught. Be quiet. Be small. Be easy to ignore. Outside, a pickup truck rumbled past, its tires humming against the pavement, and the faint smell of gasoline drifted in each time the door opened. Somewhere behind the counter, a waitress laughed too loudly at something that wasn't that funny, and a coffee pot clicked softly as it warmed on its burner. Life moved. It always did, just not toward her. Lily shifted slightly in her chair, careful, controlled, the subtle adjustment of someone used to working around limits her body had set long ago. She glanced at the empty seat across from her table. Just one. That was all she needed. Not a conversation. Not attention. Just presence. Her lips parted slightly, as if rehearsing something she had said before, something simple, something small enough not to bother anyone. The bell above the diner door chimed. A low, quiet sound. Not loud enough to turn every head, but enough. A man stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying the stillness of someone who had learned to move without wasting energy. His jacket was worn but clean, olive green, the kind that had seen weather in miles. His hair was short, dark with hints of gray at the edges, and his face bore the kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from surviving what tried to take it away. Beside him walked a German shepherd. Large. Alert. His coat was a deep sable, black blending into warm tan, every line of his body steady and purposeful. His ears stood tall, catching sounds no one else noticed. His amber eyes moved slowly, deliberately, reading the room like a story written in scent and silence. The man, Ethan Cole, paused just inside the doorway, scanning out of habit, not curiosity. But the dog didn't. The dog stopped. Not abruptly. Not uncertain. Just stopped. His gaze fixed across the diner, past the clatter of dishes and the shifting bodies, past the noise and movement, until it landed on something small. Something quiet. Something the rest of the world had already decided not to see. Lily felt it before she understood it. That subtle shift in the air when attention finds you. Her fingers tightened slightly in her lap. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her eyes. And for the first time that day, someone was already looking back. The room did not change, but something inside it shifted, quiet as a breath you only notice after it is gone. Ranger did not move at first, not even a step, just stood there with that stillness that was not hesitation but decision, his eyes locked on Lily. As if the noise of the diner had drained away and left only her in its place. And Ethan felt the tension travel down the leash, subtle but certain, the kind of signal that had once meant danger, or something hidden, something others missed. He followed the line of that gaze without thinking, his boots pressing softly against the worn tile floor, and then he saw her, small, tucked into the corner, trying so carefully to take up less space than the chair she sat in, and something in his chest tightened before he could name it. Not pain exactly. Not yet. Just recognition of something he had spent years trying to outrun. Ranger took one step forward, then another, slow, deliberate. As if approaching something fragile, something that might disappear if startled, the leash loosened in Ethan's hand without him realizing it. And for a moment he did not call him back, did not correct him, did not give the command that discipline had carved into him over a lifetime. Because this was not disobedience. This was something else, something older than training. Lily felt the movement before she fully saw it, the soft rhythm of paws against tile, the faint jingle of a tag that caught the light, and her breath caught just slightly, not fear, but surprise, because things did not move toward her, not usually, not without being called, and she had not called anything, not out loud. Ranger stopped a few feet from her table, close enough that she could see the texture of his fur, the way the darker strands along his back shifted like shadows over warm earth, close enough to notice the steadiness in his eyes, not curious, not cautious, just present, and he lowered his head slightly, not submissive, not dominant, simply level with her, as if meeting her where she was instead of asking her to rise to him. The sounds of the diner pressed back and around them, a fork clinking against a plate, a chair scraping faintly, the low murmur of a conversation that had nothing to do with any of this, and yet it all felt distant, like something happening behind glass. Ethan stopped a few steps behind his dog, his hand still wrapped loosely around the leash, his gaze fixed now on the girl, really seeing her, not the chair first, not the space she occupied, but her, and that was the part that unsettled him most, because he had learned, over time, how often people reverse that order without even realizing it. He shifted his weight slightly, the floor creaking under his boot, and for a brief second he hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from something deeper, something that lived in memory, the echo of a moment years ago when hesitation had cost more than it should have, when 1 second of not moving had stayed with him longer than any mission ever had. Lily swallowed softly, her fingers tightening just a little in her lap, and she looked from the dog to the man and back again, her voice forming in the quiet space between heartbeat and breath, fragile but clear, practiced, but still carrying something real underneath it. And when she spoke, it was barely above a whisper, but it carried anyway, because silence has a way of making room for certain words. Can I sit here? It was such a small question, shaped like something simple, something polite, something easy to answer, but it was not really about the chair, not really about the space at the table. It was about permission, about existence, about whether she was allowed to be near someone without being moved aside, and for a fraction of a second, no one answered. Not because they did not hear, but because the weight of it settled before the meaning did. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words catching somewhere behind old memories he did not invite, but never fully escaped, the image of a different voice, a different moment, asking for something just as small, just as human, and him not answering fast enough, not moving soon enough, and the guilt of that had a way of showing up when he least expected it, like now, in a diner that smelled like coffee and fried food, and something quietly breaking open. But Ranger did not wait. He stepped forward that final distance, slow and certain, and without hesitation, he rested his head gently against Lily's knee, the contact soft, steady, undeniable, and in that simple motion, something shifted again, not in the room, but in her, her shoulders easing just slightly, her breath leaving her in a way that sounded almost like relief, as if for the first time that day, she did not have to disappear. For a moment, neither of them moved, and in that stillness something fragile began to take shape, not loud enough to be seen, not strong enough to be named, but present in the way Lily's fingers slowly unfolded from themselves, in the way her shoulders lowered just a fraction as Ranger's weight rested gently against her knee, steady and warm, like a quiet promise that did not need words to hold. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, and stepped closer, the soft thud of his boots on tile marking the distance he had hesitated to cross just seconds ago. And when he reached the table, he pulled the chair out across from her without asking again. the legs scraping lightly against the floor, a small sound that somehow carried more meaning than anything he could have said, and then he sat down, not across from her, but slightly angled, as if leaving space for the moment to settle instead of filling it too quickly. The waitress glanced over from behind the counter, her hand pausing mid-motion over a coffee pot, eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity, because it was not often that a man like Ethan, composed, reserved, carrying the quiet gravity of someone who had lived through more than he spoke about, chose the far corner table, chose the girl no one else had chosen, and yet here he was, as if it were the most natural decision in the world. Ranger did not move from Lily's side, his head still resting lightly against her, but his ears flicked once, catching every sound, every shift in the room, the low hum of conversation, the faint buzz of the overhead lights, the rhythm of a place that did not yet understand what was happening within it. Lily looked down at him, her hand hovering just above his fur, unsure, hesitant, as if asking permission for something she had never been given freely, and when her fingers finally brushed against his coat, it was barely more than a whisper of touch, soft, careful, like someone touching something they were afraid might disappear, and Ranger responded not with movement, but with presence, leaning ever so slightly into her hand, grounding the moment in something real. "He likes you," Ethan said quietly, his voice low, steady, the kind of voice that did not rush, did not fill space unnecessarily, and Lily glanced up at him, surprise flickering across her face, not at the words themselves, but at the tone, because there was no pity in it, no careful adjustment meant to soften reality, just a simple truth offered without weight. "Most people don't," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, not bitter, not angry, just honest, the kind of honesty that comes from repetition, from learning something too many times to pretend it is not real. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition, because he knew that tone, had heard it in different voices, different places, in men who had come back from places they could not fully explain, men who had learned to say things simply because anything else would have taken too much energy, and he nodded once, slow, deliberate, acknowledging without correcting. "People miss things," he replied after a moment, his eyes shifting briefly to Ranger, then back to her. "He doesn't." Lily looked down again, her hand now resting more fully against the dog's fur, the movement no longer tentative, and for the first time since she had entered the diner, her posture changed, not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice, but enough, her back a little straighter, her head not quite as lowered, as if the invisible weight she had been carrying had shifted just enough to let her breathe differently. Across the room, a man in a baseball cap glanced over, then nudged the woman beside him, their attention drawn not by noise, but by the absence of it, by the way this corner of the diner had become something else entirely, quieter, steadier, as if the air itself had slowed. The waitress approached slowly, her footsteps softer than before, as if instinctively matching the tone of the table, and she offered a small smile, not forced, not distant, just present. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her eyes moving between Ethan and Lily, and for a brief second, there was no hesitation in Lily at all. "Hot chocolate, please," she said, her voice a little stronger now, and the waitress nodded, coming right up, before turning away, the order simple, but the moment not. Ethan rested his forearms lightly on the table, his hands loosely clasped, watching as Lily continued to stroke Ranger's fur in slow, careful motions, and something in that rhythm pulled at him, not sharply, not painfully, but persistently, like a memory that refused to stay buried, and for a second, just a second, the diner faded, replaced by a different room, a different moment, a voice asking for something small, something simple, and him not answering in time, and he blinked, the image gone as quickly as it had come, but the echo of it remained, quiet, steady, reminding him of what hesitation costs. Ranger's ears shifted again, his head lifting slightly from Lily's knee, not fully, just enough, his posture changing in a way so subtle most would not notice. But Ethan did, because he had seen it before, not in diners, not in quiet corners, but in places where attention meant everything, where noticing something early made the difference between calm and chaos, and his gaze sharpened just slightly, not alarmed, but focused, As Ranger's eyes moved from Lily's face to her hands, then to her posture, then back again, as if reading something beneath the surface, something unspoken, something not yet visible. And in that moment, Ethan understood one thing clearly. This was not just a meeting, not just a coincidence, not just a dog choosing a girl in a crowded room. This was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, and something Ranger had already decided mattered. The hot chocolate arrived with a soft clink as the mug met the table, steam rising in thin, curling ribbons that caught the late afternoon light. And for a moment, everything felt almost ordinary, almost like any other quiet corner in any other small-town diner. But Ranger did not settle back into that illusion. His posture remained just slightly elevated, his head no longer resting fully against Lily's knee, his attention shifting in small, precise movements, the kind that spoke not of restlessness, but of awareness, and Ethan noticed it immediately, because he had learned long ago that Ranger never changed position without reason. Lily wrapped her hands around the mug carefully, her fingers curling against the warmth, and a small breath escaped her lips, something close to comfort, something she did not question, because moments like this were rare enough that she had learned not to look too closely at them, just to feel them while they lasted. And she lifted the cup slowly, taking a small sip, her eyes softening as the warmth spread, grounding her in a way she had not expected. "Thank you," she said quietly, not just for the drink, not just for the seat, but for something larger she could not fully name. And Ethan nodded once, his gaze still flicking briefly toward Ranger, then back to her. "You are welcome," he replied, his voice steady, but there was a slight edge of focus beneath it now, the kind that did not interrupt calm, but watched it closely. Ranger shifted again, this time more noticeably, his body angling slightly closer to Lily, his nose lowering toward her hands, not in curiosity, but in inspection, slow, deliberate, his breath steady as he drew in her scent, then paused, then repeated, as if confirming something he did not fully trust on the first pass. Lily stilled slightly, not pulling away, but aware now of the change, her fingers tightening just a little around the mug, and Ethan leaned forward just a fraction, his eyes narrowing in quiet concentration, because he had seen this pattern before, not in places like this, not in moments this gentle, but in situations where Ranger had sensed something beneath the surface, something that did not yet show itself in obvious ways. "Hey," Ethan said softly, not to stop him, but to ground the moment, his tone low, reassuring. But Ranger did not look up, did not break focus, his attention fixed entirely on Lily, and then slowly, carefully, he lifted his head and brought it closer to her chest, not touching, just hovering for a second, then lowering slightly, listening, feeling, reading something deeper than sight could offer. Lily's breath caught, not in fear, but in confusion, her eyes flickering between Ethan and the dog. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice quieter now, uncertainty threading through it, and Ethan held her gaze for a second, measuring his response, not wanting to alarm her, but not willing to dismiss what he was seeing, because Ranger did not guess, he did not assume, he recognized. "He is," Ethan said carefully, "he just pays attention to things most people miss." The words settled between them, simple, but carrying weight, and Lily looked down again, her hand instinctively moving to rest against Ranger's head, this time with more confidence, more trust, as if the contact itself reassured her, even if she did not understand. "Why?" Across the diner, a chair scraped louder than before, a man standing up abruptly, glancing over with mild irritation. But the moment passed quickly, the world continuing its quiet rhythm, unaware of the shift happening in this small corner. Ranger pulled back slightly, his ears tilting forward, his body tensing just enough to signal alertness, and then he let out a low, soft sound. Not a bark, not a growl, but something in between, something that carried intention without urgency, and Ethan's posture changed instantly, his shoulders straightening, his focus sharpening, because that sound meant one thing, something was not right, not yet dangerous, not yet visible, but not right. "Lily," Ethan said gently, his voice calm but more direct now, "do you feel okay?" The question lingered in the air, simple on the surface, but different from the one she was used to, not polite, not routine, but intentional, and she blinked, surprised, thinking for a moment before answering. I think so, she said, then hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly as she considered something she had long learned to ignore. Sometimes I get a little tight here, she added, placing her hand lightly against her upper chest, the gesture small, almost dismissive, like something she had mentioned before and been told not to worry about. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to her hand, then back to Ranger, whose eyes had not left her, whose body remained poised, steady, waiting, and in that quiet space between question and understanding, Ethan felt it. Not panic, not fear, but clarity, the kind that arrives before anyone else sees the reason for it. And he knew, with a certainty he had learned never to ignore, that this moment mattered more than it appeared. The air around the table seemed to tighten, not visibly, not in a way anyone across the room would notice, but in the subtle way silence changes when something important is about to unfold, and Ethan felt it settle into his chest with a familiar weight, the kind that did not rush him, did not panic him, but sharpened every sense he had learned to trust. Ranger remained still, but not relaxed, his body angled protectively toward Lily now, his eyes steady, unblinking, as if holding her in place without touching her, as if waiting for something to reveal itself. Lily shifted slightly in her chair, her hand still resting against her chest where she had placed it moments ago, her fingers pressing just a little more firmly now, not out of fear, but out of instinct, like someone responding to a sensation they had learned to live with rather than question. "It is nothing," she said softly, almost apologetically, her voice carrying the quiet habit of minimizing her own discomfort. "It happens sometimes." Ethan did not interrupt her, did not correct her, but he did not look away either, his gaze steady, grounded, as if anchoring the moment before it drifted into dismissal. "How often?" he asked gently, his tone calm, measured, leaving space for her to answer without pressure. Lily hesitated, her eyes lowering slightly as she thought. "I do not know, a few times a week, maybe," she admitted, her voice smaller now, as if saying it out loud made it more real than she wanted it to be. Ranger let out another soft sound, slightly more insistent this time, not loud, not alarming, but enough to shift Ethan's attention fully, and he leaned forward just a fraction more, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his posture steady but engaged. "Does it ever make it hard to breathe?" he asked, his voice still even, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that carried experience, recognition, and Lily nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. "Sometimes, but it goes away," she added quickly, as if needing to reassure him, or maybe herself. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking once more to Ranger, whose body had not relaxed at all, whose focus had only sharpened, and in that moment, the pieces aligned in a way Ethan had learned never to ignore, not because he understood everything, but because he trusted what Ranger understood without explanation. "Okay," Ethan said quietly, his tone steady, reassuring. "We are not going to ignore that." The words were simple, but they landed differently than anything Lily had heard before, not dismissive, not overly concerned, just certain, and she looked up at him, confusion and something else flickering in her eyes, something that might have been hope, though she did not fully recognize it yet. Across the diner, the waitress glanced over again, her attention lingering now, sensing the shift even if she could not name it, and Ethan raised his hand slightly, signaling her over, his movements calm, controlled, not urgent, but intentional. When she approached, her expression softened, her voice quieter than before. "Everything okay?" she asked, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady. "I think we should get someone to take a look at her, just to be safe," he said, his tone respectful, not commanding, but firm enough to carry weight. The waitress blinked, surprised for a brief second, then looked at Lily, really looked this time, her expression changing from polite distance to something more present, more aware. "Sweetheart, are you feeling all right?" she asked gently, and Lily hesitated, caught between what she had always said and what she was now being asked to consider, and after a moment, she gave a small, uncertain shake of her head, not fully no, not fully yes, but enough. Ranger shifted closer, pressing lightly against her leg again, grounding her, and Ethan placed his hand calmly on the table, not reaching for her, not overwhelming her, just there, steady, a quiet presence that did not ask for anything in return. "We will just check," he said softly, his voice low, reassuring. "No rush, no pressure, just making sure you are okay." And for the first time in a long time, Lily did not feel like she needed to say she was fine when she was not. The waitress moved quickly now, her earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet sense of purpose, her steps soft but deliberate as she reached for the phone behind the counter, her voice lowering as she spoke into it, not urgent enough to cause alarm, but serious enough to carry weight. And the diner, though still filled with the same sounds, the same clinking and murmuring, seemed to lean just slightly toward the corner where something unseen was unfolding. Lily sat very still, her hands now resting in her lap again, the mug of hot chocolate forgotten for the moment, the warmth fading slowly into the air, and she watched Ethan with a mixture of uncertainty and something unfamiliar, something fragile that had not yet taken shape into trust, but was no longer fear. "Am I in trouble?" she asked quietly, the question small, almost reflexive, as if attention had always come with consequence in her experience. Ethan shook his head gently, his expression steady, his voice calm in a way that did not dismiss her concern, but met it where it was. "No, you are not in trouble," he said, each word clear, grounded. "We just want to make sure you are okay." Ranger shifted again, this time sitting fully beside her, his body close but not crowding, his presence constant, and he leaned his shoulder lightly against her leg, a steady pressure that seemed to anchor her in place. And Lily's breathing, which had grown slightly uneven without her noticing, began to settle into a slower rhythm, guided more by the dog than by anything she consciously controlled. Ethan watched her closely, not with worry, but with attention, the kind that noticed small changes, the rise and fall of her chest, the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her fingers curled and uncurled as if responding to something beneath the surface. "Can you tell me when it starts?" he asked gently, his tone careful, not demanding, and Lily nodded slowly, her gaze dropping as she focused inward, trying to find the right words for something she had never been asked to describe in detail. "It feels like it gets tight right here," she said, placing her hand against her chest again, her fingers pressing slightly. "And then it gets harder to take a deep breath, but it goes away after a little while." Ethan listened without interrupting, his mind quiet, his focus steady, and Ranger's ears flicked once more, his eyes never leaving her, as if confirming every word she spoke through something deeper than sound. The door to the diner opened again, the bell chiming softly, and a man stepped in wearing a light jacket with a small medical emblem stitched on the front, his presence calm, unhurried, as if he had been called not into chaos, but into something that required careful attention, and the waitress moved toward him quickly, speaking in a low voice, her hand gesturing toward the corner table. The man nodded once, then walked over, his steps measured, his expression neutral but kind, and when he reached them, he crouched slightly to meet Lily at eye level, not towering over her, not making her feel smaller than she already had. "Hey there," he said gently. "My name is Daniel. I heard you might not be feeling your best." Lily looked at him, then at Ethan, then at Ranger, and for a brief moment, the choice passed through her eyes, whether to retreat into the familiar answer, or to stay in this unfamiliar space where people were actually listening, and she chose to stay. "It just feels tight sometimes," she repeated, her voice steadier now, and Daniel nodded slowly, his attention focused, his demeanor calm. "All right," he said. "We are just going to take a quick look, nothing scary, okay?" Lily gave a small nod, her hand still resting lightly against Ranger's fur, and as Daniel reached for his small kit, checking her pulse with gentle precision, asking simple, clear questions, Ranger remained perfectly still beside her, his body aligned with hers, his presence unwavering, as if he had already decided that he would not leave her side until whatever this was had passed, and Ethan sat quietly across from them, watching, not intervening, not speaking unless needed, but fully present, in a way that made the moment feel held, contained, as if nothing outside this table could interrupt what was happening here. And for the first time in a long time, Lily was not being overlooked, not being dismissed, but being seen, fully, completely, exactly as she was. Daniel's fingers rested lightly against Lily's wrist, steady and practiced, counting not just the rhythm of her pulse but the story it carried beneath the surface. And his expression, though calm, shifted ever so slightly, a subtle tightening around his eyes that Ethan noticed immediately, because he had learned to read those small changes the way others read words. "All right," Daniel said softly, his voice even, reassuring. "Your pulse is a little irregular right now, not dangerous in this moment, but not something we should ignore either." And he glanced briefly at Ethan, then at Ranger, as if acknowledging without saying it aloud that something had already been noticed before he arrived. Lily listened quietly, her hand still resting against Ranger's fur, her fingers now moving in slow, absent strokes as if the motion itself helped her stay grounded, and though the words might have unsettled someone else, she did not pull away, did not retreat, because for once, the attention on her did not feel like judgment, it felt like care. "Have you ever had this checked before?" Daniel asked gently, his tone inviting, not accusing, and Lily shook her head slightly, her eyes lowering. "No. My mom says it is probably just stress," she said, her voice small but steady, repeating something she had likely heard more than once, something that had become easier to accept than question. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of a pattern he had seen too often, where something real was softened into something dismissible, not out of cruelty, but out of assumption, and he leaned back just a fraction, giving Daniel space, but remaining fully present, his attention never leaving Lily. Ranger shifted again, his body pressing a little closer now, his head lifting just enough to rest lightly against her side, his ears forward, his eyes calm but unyielding, as if holding the moment steady, as if refusing to let it slip back into being overlooked. "It could be stress," Daniel said carefully, his voice measured, "but it could also be something with your heart rhythm, something we can check with the right equipment, something we should not guess about." And he paused for a moment, letting the words settle, not rushing her, not overwhelming her, just offering clarity where there had been uncertainty. Lily nodded slowly, her fingers tightening slightly in Ranger's fur, not out of fear, but out of focus, as if she was trying to hold onto the moment, to understand it fully before it passed. Around them, the diner had grown quieter, not completely silent, but attentive in a way that did not intrude. Conversations lowered, glances softened, as if the room itself had begun to understand that something important was happening in that small corner. The waitress stood near the counter now, her hands resting still, her eyes fixed on Lily with a concern that had replaced the earlier distance, and even the man in the baseball cap had stopped eating, his gaze lingering, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to empathy. "We should get you to a clinic," Daniel continued gently. "Nothing urgent, but soon, just to run a few tests and make sure everything is okay." And he offered a small, reassuring smile. "It is always better to know than to guess." Lily looked up at Ethan then, her eyes searching his face, not because she expected him to decide for her, but because somewhere in the quiet of this moment, she had begun to trust him in a way she had not expected, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, his expression steady, grounded, the kind of presence that did not push, but did not waver either. "We can go together," he said simply, his voice calm, certain. "You will not be alone." The words landed softly, but deeply, and for a brief second, Lily's expression shifted, something fragile breaking open beneath the surface, not sadness, not fear, but relief, the kind that comes when someone says something you did not realize you needed to hear. Ranger exhaled slowly, his body relaxing just slightly for the first time since the moment began, as if acknowledging that the direction had been set, that the path forward was now clear, and Ethan reached down briefly, his hand brushing lightly against Ranger's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement, a quiet gratitude for what the dog had seen before anyone else did. In that small corner of a roadside diner, nothing dramatic had happened, no loud moment, no sudden change, but something far more important had taken place, something quiet, something precise, something that began with a dog who refused to look away, and a girl who, for the first time, was no longer invisible. The decision did not arrive with urgency, but it carried weight all the same, settling into the space between them like something that had already been chosen long before anyone spoke it aloud. And within minutes, the quiet rhythm of the diner began to shift again, not into chaos, but into motion, purposeful, measured, as the waitress stepped forward with a soft reassurance that she would keep an eye on things while they stepped out, and Daniel closed his small kit with careful hands, nodding once to Ethan in silent agreement that this was the right next step. Lily hesitated only for a moment as Ethan rose from his chair, the soft scrape of it against the floor marking the transition from stillness to action, and when he moved to her side, he did not reach for the handles of her wheelchair immediately. He paused just long enough to meet her eyes again, to give her the space to accept what was happening, not as something being done to her, but something being done with her. "Ready?" he asked quietly, his voice steady, and Lily nodded, a small movement, but certain, her hand still resting lightly against Ranger's back as if drawing strength from the contact. Ranger stood as well, his posture shifting seamlessly from still observation to quiet readiness, his body aligned with hers, his attention unwavering. And as Ethan gently guided the wheelchair back from the table, the movement felt less like leaving and more like carrying something forward. The bell above the diner door chimed again as they stepped outside, the late afternoon air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and distant pine, the sky stretching wide and pale gold as the sun dipped lower, and for a moment, Lily closed her eyes briefly, the fresh air brushing against her face, grounding her in a different way than the warmth inside had. The parking lot was quiet, a few cars scattered across the faded lines, their metal surfaces catching the last light of day, and Daniel walked just ahead, speaking softly into his phone, arranging for a quick check at a nearby clinic, his tone calm, efficient, as if this was simply the next step in a process that had already begun. Ethan moved steadily behind Lily, his hands light on the chair, not gripping, not controlling, just guiding, and Ranger walked close beside her, his shoulder nearly brushing against the wheel, his presence constant, protective without being overwhelming. "Is it far?" Lily asked softly, her voice carrying just a hint of uncertainty now that they had left the familiar walls of the diner, and Ethan shook his head gently, though she could not see it, his voice answering just as quietly. "Just a few minutes," he said. "We will take it one step at a time." The words settled into the air between them, simple, but steady, and Lily nodded again, her fingers tightening slightly in the fabric of her sweater, not out of fear, but out of focus, as if she was holding on to the moment, making sure it did not slip away into something less real. Ranger's ears flicked once as a car passed slowly along the road, the sound low and distant, and he adjusted his pace slightly, always in rhythm with Lily, always aware of her position, her movement, her presence, as if the world had narrowed to the space around her and nothing else mattered beyond it. At the edge of the lot, a small sedan pulled in, its engine quiet as it came to a stop, and Daniel gestured toward it with a calm nod. "This will get us there quickly," he said, opening the rear door with a practiced ease, and Ethan paused. Once more, moving around to Lily's side, his movements careful, respectful, ensuring she was comfortable, ensuring she felt included in each step, not rushed, not overlooked. For a brief second, Lily looked up at him again, her eyes searching, not for answers, but for reassurance, and she found it there, steady and unspoken, in the way he did not look away, in the way he remained present without pressing, and she let out a small breath she had not realized she had been holding. Ranger stepped in last, settling himself near her feet, his body positioned in a way that kept him close without crowding, his gaze still fixed on her, his awareness unchanged, and as the car door closed with a soft, final click, the outside world faded into a muted hum, replaced by the quiet interior space where everything felt just a little more contained, a little more certain. The engine started, the car easing forward onto the road, and as the diner grew smaller in the distance, something larger took its place, not visible in the fading light, not loud enough to be named, but present all the same, a quiet unfolding, a path set in motion by a moment no one else had noticed, except the dog who refused to look away. The clinic was quiet in a different way than the diner, not filled with the soft hum of conversation, but with the steady, measured silence of a place where people came to understand what their bodies had been trying to say. And as the car came to a gentle stop under the pale glow of a single overhead light, Ethan stepped out first, the cool evening air brushing against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of clean pavement and distant rain, and for a brief moment, he stood still, grounding himself before moving again. Daniel opened the rear door carefully, his movements unhurried, giving Lily space as Ethan came around to her side, his hands light as he helped guide the chair back onto the pavement, steady, controlled, and Ranger followed close behind, his paws landing softly, his body immediately aligning with hers as if nothing in the world could pull him away from that position now. Inside, the clinic lights were warm but bright, illuminating clean floors and quiet hallways, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air, and a nurse at the front desk looked up as they entered, her expression shifting quickly from routine to attentive as Daniel offered a brief explanation, his voice calm, clear, and within moments, they were guided into a small examination room where everything felt contained, focused, intentional. Lily sat quietly as the nurse placed gentle monitors against her chest, small sensors that carried no pain, only purpose, and for the first time, her eyes flickered with something closer to unease, not because of what was happening, but because it was unfamiliar, because no one had ever looked this closely before, and Ranger sensed it immediately, stepping closer, his body pressing lightly against her leg, his presence anchoring her in the same quiet way it had in the diner, steady, unwavering, constant. Ethan stood nearby, not hovering, not crowding, but present in a way that filled the room without taking it over, his gaze moving between Lily and the monitor beside her, where soft green lines began to trace the rhythm of her heartbeat, rising and falling in patterns that spoke a language he did not fully understand, but trusted others would. Daniel watched closely, his eyes focused, his expression thoughtful, and after a few moments, he nodded once, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect. "There it is," he said quietly, not alarming, just certain, and he glanced at Ethan, then back to Lily. "Your heart rhythm shifts at times, not constantly, but enough that we should look deeper, something called an arrhythmia, and the good news is, we caught it early." The words settled gently, not heavy, not overwhelming, just clear, and Lily blinked, processing slowly, her fingers tightening slightly in Ranger's fur, not in fear, but in focus, as if trying to understand what this meant for her, for the quiet discomfort she had learned to ignore. "Is it bad?" she asked softly, her voice steady but small, and Daniel shook his head gently, offering a reassuring smile. "It can be managed, especially when we know it is there. We will run a few more tests, make a plan, and you will not have to guess anymore." Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath that carried something deeper than relief, something closer to quiet gratitude, and his hand moved briefly to rest against Ranger's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of what had been seen before anyone else had understood it. Lily looked down at Ranger then, her hand moving more confidently now, resting against his head, her fingers no longer hesitant, and for a moment, her expression softened into something that had not been there before, something warm, something certain. "You knew," she whispered, not expecting an answer, but meaning it all the same, and Ranger simply remained where he was, his eyes calm, his presence unchanged, as if knowing did not require explanation. The room remained quiet, the steady beeping of the monitor filling the space with a gentle rhythm, and outside, the evening settled into night, the world continuing on as it always did, unaware of the small miracle that had taken place, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, the kind that begins with a question no one expects to matter, and ends with a life quietly changed because someone chose to listen, and something chose to notice, when no one else did.